Hi, my name is Scott Bentley. I'm a platform configuration engineer and developer for Esri Professional Services. This is the developer primer for Python notebooks in the Esri ecosystem, specifically Jupyter Notebooks. This is part of Esri's Dev Summit 2020, which is now a virtual conference. I will just say this talk is a very high-level review of Jupyter Notebooks in the Esri environment. So if you're very familiar with Jupyter Notebooks, this probably isn't for you. More of the in-depth talks on what you can do with heavy use of Jupyter Notebooks would probably be better. But if you're unfamiliar with them, this should hopefully give you context for when there are those deeper dives into Jupyter Notebooks and other Esri talks. With that, let's move right into the agenda for this talk. So we will begin with the basics of what is a Jupyter Notebook and what constitutes them. Then we'll move into Jupyter Notebooks in the Esri ecosystem, and then a very short demo of just running code in a Jupyter Notebook. With that, so what is a Jupyter Notebook? So what is a Jupyter Notebook? To take it straight from the source, it's an open source web application that allows you to create and share documents that contain live code, equations, visualizations, and narrative text. So that's straight from the Jupyter project. So these notebooks were, the original incarnation of them was IPython notebooks. Now Jupyter Notebooks still use the same backend kernel, which is IPython, but now they have improved upon it by making it language agnostic. And just to explain what they are, they're just feature-rich web-based IDE. It's basically what it is, right? So it's not like Eclipse or Visual Studio, but it does have capability for running code and writing code. So it still is an IDE, but not the same as what we think of as a traditional IDE. Let's move on to what the basics are of Jupyter Notebooks. So again, we're just going to take the description from Jupyter project because it's better to get it from the source. So there are two main components of Jupyter Notebook. One is the web application, and that's defined as a browser-based tool for interactive authoring of documents which combine explanatory text, mathematics, computations, and their rich media output. That's a really wordy definition, but if we want to use an analogy here, think of this as Microsoft Word, right? This is the application that you are building documents in, which brings us to our next one, the actual notebook documents. So these are a representation of all content visible in the web application, including inputs and outputs of the computations, explanatory text, mathematics, images, and rich media representations of objects. So that one is a even more wordy definition of what a notebook document is. But to go back to our analogy, think of this as the docx file that you would create in Microsoft Word, right? So these are where your code is, where any rich text or multimedia is in the narrative of someone reading the notebook, and additionally the outputs, right? So like I said, just think of these sort of as the actual documents that are saved out, and the web application is where you're authoring these documents. So this is just an example of starting the Jupyter web application. So here I'm just going to type in Python command prompt, which is installed when you install ArcGIS Pro. So this is an easy way to get to it. So here we just type in Jupyter Notebook. So if you have ArcGIS Pro installed, this is already on your system, and you run this command, what will happen is the command will run and create a little web application hosted on localhost 8888 by default. And as you see, it opens right up. The command even opens the browser for you. And here you go. The web application is started. And this is where you can begin to create new notebook documents. And so this is just a short example of writing a new notebook. So you just come to the top right, press New, choose your Python version, and then voila, here's your notebook. And you can rename it to whatever you'd like. And then once you're inside a notebook, say you want to create another one, a new notebook, then it's right in the file menu. And you just repeat the process, and you have a second notebook. As for the notebook document makeup, there are three types of cells inside of a Jupyter notebook. So the three types of cells are a code cell, markdown cell, and raw cell. So code cells are where your code is to be executed is located. And this is where you're writing code also. So in each of these cells, when you want to run one of them, you just hit Shift Enter and it'll run an individual cell, which can be any amount of line of code. It could be 1, it could be 100. So if it's, let's say for example, we just have a code that says print hello world, right? So that's all you would see in your code cell is print hello world. So in a markdown cell, markdown cells are, earlier you heard me reference narrative text and images. Markdown cells are where you're going to put markdown language, right? So you can have rich text. So for example, you put strong tags around a phrase to make it like, bold and larger font. And then you can put an image tag and source the image, and very similar to HTML, right? Which is another markdown language. And basically this is where you would put instructions for someone reading the notebook, or visualizations, like static visualizations, to help someone maybe understand what they're about to create in a code cell. So I like to think of these as a way to talk to the notebook user or reader about what is going on as they're going through the notebook. Raw cells, the last type, are output of code cells. So in our earlier example of printing hello world, right, you actually would not see a raw cell. You wouldn't see it until you hit Shift Enter on the code cell, and then you would see in the raw cell just hello world, right, because it's the actual evaluated output. So here's an example of each of the type of cells, and these are actually in the demo at the end of the presentation. We'll just evaluate them and show sort of the flow of running these. The first one is a markdown cell. As you can see, I have the strong tags around the words markdown cell, so they'll appear as a title, bold, like I said. Then there's also an image sourced here, which is an Esri logo, and you'll see what that looks like when we evaluate it in the demo. But that's pretty much what a markdown cell looks like. A code cell is what we all know and love, right? The actual raw code of what you're writing. And here I'm just making a connection to Portal. And when I run it, the raw cell appears. So again, if you were making this document, you wouldn't see that raw cell until you run the code cell. And as you'll notice, right, the raw cell is just outputting that last line I have in the code cell, where it's printing the JSON object of the portal connection, which you can interrogate, right, to get information about it. But basically, if I didn't have that print cell there, that raw cell would have nothing in it because there is no output. So again, raw cells are just output of code cells. So they aren't evaluated specifically, but they are the resulting evaluation of the code cell. So let's move into an important topic of when to use a Jupyter Notebook. Jupyter Notebooks are great for proof of concepts. To give you a real-world example, we have a portal that we manage, and we have to deploy custom symbols to it for users to use in the web map viewer. So when I was trying to figure out how to write the code, I was trying to know which pieces of code needed to be executed at which time, and I also needed to get familiar with how they would work. So Jupyter Notebooks were great for stepping through little pieces, lines of code, say 5 to 10 lines, to make sure they're good and logically sound. So Jupyter Notebooks are great for proof of concepts and helping you write a more long piece of code where you're not running the script and checking the logs, making improvements, and repeating that over and over. Also demonstrating workflows. If you're trying to demonstrate what's happening in your script to someone that may not be as code savvy, Jupyter Notebooks are great for that. Administration tasks run at irregular intervals. Say if you want to ensure your portal user base is, you're not having users that are completely unnecessary. If you want to check how many users haven't had an item for a year or something like that, that would be great for a Jupyter Notebook to do. And that obviously has no real cadence, right? So it's much easier for a person to run that, and they can make the decisions they need to make, as opposed to a computer running it at a specific time. So quick checks, like I said in my earlier example, if you just want to check the users that maybe haven't had a portal item, you just come into your notebook, the code's already written, you just press Shift Enter, and your check is done in the time it takes to press Shift Enter. Data science and visualizations. Jupyter Notebook is great for if you have certain statistical analysis, say you're running, right, and you want to see what it looks like. You can come into Jupyter Notebook, and once you've written the code once, you can come in and run it again. And you can get the same visualizations, and you're not being slowed down by the UI, you're saving clicks, and you're saving time. Jupyter Notebooks are great for data science and visualizations. And there's also a smaller developer learning curve. You don't really have as much of a problem as worrying about environment configuration. So Jupyter Notebooks are great for sort of jump-starting someone in writing Python code. And now we move to arguably an even more important topic of when not to use a Jupyter Notebook. As for when not to use a Jupyter Notebook, in my earlier example I talked about administration tasks run at irregular intervals. You definitely shouldn't use it for things run at regular intervals. That's best left to things like cron jobs or jobs run in Windows Task Scheduler. That just isn't appropriate for Jupyter Notebooks. When scripts take a large amount of time or certain commands, say a command takes 8 hours to run, you probably shouldn't be using a Jupyter Notebook. That's best left to run in the background. And then if you're creating things that need a lot of end user capability, that's best done in JavaScript, things like Web App Builder and Experience Builder. And this also goes for the production application line item here. Typically, JavaScript is going to be best if you're building web apps or adding widgets. There's just a lot more flexibility there, and Jupyter Notebooks aren't really meant for that. Also, if you're delivering an end user product, you typically don't want to have a Jupyter Notebook as what you're delivering, unless that's specifically what you were called out to do. Usually end user products are going to be your more traditional things like web maps, web apps, right, or a static map. That's not or like a chart or visualization. That's not really what Jupyter Notebooks are made for. You would just deliver them just the chart, just the map. Now that we've gone over the basics of Jupyter Notebooks, let's talk about how they fit into the Esri ecosystem at large. The three main pillars of Jupyter Notebooks in the Esri ecosystem are ArcPy, the ArcGIS Python API, and the novel ArcGIS Notebook server. So with ArcPy, just to sort of explain what it is, it's the Python environment within ArcGIS Pro and ArcGIS Desktop where you can perform geoprocessing tasks without the UI. And this is just sort of in here because Jupyter Notebooks typically are Python, and if you can write ArcPy tasks in them. You can also additionally do ArcGIS Python API code. So just to explain, the ArcGIS Python API is basically it's geared towards the WebGIS aspect of the ArcGIS stack. So ArcGIS Enterprise, right, Portal, ArcGIS Server, and it's there to programmatically interact with ArcGIS Enterprise in a more intuitive way. It's basically one level abstraction of the sharing API and the REST API, the admin REST API. So these APIs are, typical REST APIs, and traditionally you would have to, use the request library or URL lib and go through the whole process of getting tokens and, actually performing the tasks, and it's just a little more overhead, and it's a more Pythonic way to do these kind of tasks. It makes it much easier to read and write code when you're using the Python API as opposed to the original sharing and admin REST APIs. And the ArcGIS Notebook server is a newer product that basically allows notebooks to be hosted within Portal. So just like you have a web app item or a web map or a uploaded CSV as an item in Portal, now you can have actual Python notebooks as items. So this just allows you to actually have these living and breathing notebooks inside of your Portal or ArcGIS Online organization. So in the next slide there will be a larger version of this, but this is basically just a Python notebook that I have to smoke test Portal after upgrades. And this part is just uploading a CSV to Portal in a notebook. Okay, so this first cell here that you saw earlier is a markdown cell. And so as you see, I'll press Shift Enter on this markdown cell, and you'll see this evaluated. Notice the markdown cell text and the logo that will appear. So as you can see, you could have rich text and accompanying visualizations to sort of help someone read through it. So this is the code cell where I'm just creating a connection to Portal, and this is going to output the connection properties to Portal, and that's just the JSON representation of what is in the portal. And I'm highlighting it here. As you saw earlier, that will output the raw cell. So we'll just scroll up, and as it makes the connection, there we go. It's our information about our connection to Portal. So if you need to ask in your code about your connection, this is something you would likely use. And that's just to sort of show, that your code you're writing will output to a raw cell. And so this is just another cell where I'm basically uploading a CSV that I have on my file system to Portal, and then it will eventually publish the item. So you have the information about the CSV Portal item that you want to put in there, and basically it's just going to go in, begin uploading CSV, and publish it. So as we'll see, we'll press Shift Enter here, and you can see the output. So there is the thumbnail of the Portal item. So like I said, this is just a short little demo of running the code cells, and I'm sure you can see it as you get more in depth. You can do a lot of stuff in these Jupyter Notebooks. And since this is virtual, I just wanted to put up some resources of what I used for this presentation, and so that you can take this information and further use it. Here are the links to the Jupyter project, ArcGIS Python API, the ArcGIS Pro ArcPy, and ArcGIS Notebook Server, and also my email. So these are all just the main pages for sort of the documentation of all of these. So feel free to use them in your eventual uses of Jupyter Notebooks and ArcGIS Python environment. So since this is a virtual presentation, as I said earlier, there won't be a question period, but if you have questions, feel free to email me. That was on the previous slide about ArcGIS and Python notebooks and how they're used. And I hope to see you at the next Dev Summit that hopefully will not be virtual. So I thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening, and I hope this has helped you prime your knowledge for the more in-depth uses of Python notebooks in the Esri ecosystem. Thank you.